I'm real sorry too, but you know, there's not really anything you can do when a fight is a steady fight. I don't like to fight.
At 81 years old, Leona Williams has decided it's time. Time to stop letting others tell her story. Time to step out of the shadow of a man whose name has followed hers for half a century. Time to put truth above myth. For years, the world reduced her to a title: Merle Haggard's wife, his muse, his harmony partner. But that label barely scratched the surface of who she was, or what she gave to country music. Behind the platinum records and legendary lyrics was a woman carrying her own bruises, her own voice, her own story, one that rarely made it past the spotlight's edge. Leona was not simply the background singer who kept the outlaw poet company. She was the sharp pen behind some of his most gut-wrenching songs. She was the one who held the line when his demons tried to drag him under. And she was the one who, for too long, chose silence because the industry didn't care to listen. Now that silence has ended. At 81, Leona Williams isn't whispering anymore. She's speaking, clearly, candidly, and finally, on her own terms. Long before the bright lights of Nashville or the shadow of Merle Haggard, Leona Williams was just Leona Belle Helton, a farm girl from tiny Vienna, Missouri. Her hometown wasn't the kind of place where dreams of music stardom seemed practical. The highway ran past without slowing, the nights were quiet, and most folks measured success in acres and livestock, not record sales. Her father tended cattle, her mother tended to the church pews and the family's discipline, but music still pulsed through that little farmhouse. Sunday mornings were filled with hymns that rattled the windows, while evenings often ended with neighbors pulling out fiddles and guitars. For young Leona, those sounds weren't background noise, they were oxygen. By 8 years old, she could already weave harmonies into gospel tunes. By 12, she was slipping into bar rooms just to keep pace with older musicians who couldn't believe a girl that small could play bass with such confidence. Country music wasn't some distant dream for her. It was instinct, something as natural as breathing. But in those days, being talented wasn't enough, especially for a girl from the Ozarks. If she wanted a stage, she'd have to build one herself, and that's exactly what she set out to do. Leona's path forward wasn't paved with connections or favors. It was carved out of grit. In the 1960s, she took every opportunity no one else wanted: radio jingles, late-night backup spots, and half-paid gigs at county fairs. If it put her in front of a microphone, she said yes. Between shifts at a local diner, she scribbled lyrics on napkins, slowly teaching herself the craft of turning heartache into melody. Her big break didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly in 1968 with her debut single, Once More. It wasn't a chart topper, but it cracked the door open, enough to prove she wasn't just another pretty voice from Missouri, enough to get Nashville's attention. Then came something bolder. She landed her own syndicated radio show, broadcasting live country music across the Midwest. At a time when women were rarely allowed to host anything, let alone a national program, Leona simply refused to ask permission. Her voice carried not just clarity, but a kind of lived-in sadness that couldn't be faked, and people listened. Behind the curtain, she was quickly becoming a songwriter that seasoned musicians leaned on. Her words were sharp, her delivery fearless, and slowly she built a reputation as country music's hidden weapon, long before she crossed paths with a legend. By the mid-1970s, Leona had carved out enough of a name to stand on her own. She was respected, if not yet a household word, and her songs were beginning to circulate through Nashville's tight-knit circles. That's when fate placed her backstage at one of Merle Haggard's shows in 1975. Haggard, already a legend, carried a presence that filled every room. Mama Tried was on every jukebox. His outlaw image was both feared and admired, and his reputation preceded him. But when Leona met him, she didn't shrink under the weight of his fame. She studied him with curiosity. To her, he wasn't a myth. He was a man with a tired smile and eyes that gave away more sorrow than swagger. They talked first about music, always music. Merle told her lyrics hit harder than most men's. Leona laughed and said most men couldn't handle the truth anyway. That exchange set the tone for everything that followed. Soon, she was invited to join his tour, not as a groupie, not as an afterthought, but as a singer and songwriter whose talent he couldn't ignore. The offer wasn't phrased as a gift, it was a test, and Leona passed it with a voice that refused to play second fiddle to anyone. What began as harmonies on stage soon became something harder to deny. The chemistry between Merle and Leona was obvious, not just to them, but to every fan leaning forward in their seats and every critic scribbling in the dark. Their voices didn't just blend, they collided in a way that made songs sound heavier, truer. Before long, audiences weren't asking if they were a couple, they were assuming it. In 1978, the assumption became fact. They married quietly, away from the industry's flashing bulbs. No glossy Nashville spread, no staged publicity stunt, just two musicians who believed that if their music could stand on its own, so could their love. Leona didn't walk down the aisle in white. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. What she wanted was something simple: truth. In the songs, in the marriage, in the way they showed up for each other. Together, they recorded duets that lit up dance halls. They played sold-out shows where the energy between them seemed to spill into the crowd. Magazines dubbed them country's new royal couple, the outlaw poet and the angelic harmony. On stage, it looked golden. Off stage, it was far more fragile. Because love between artists isn't soft. It burns bright, and sometimes it burns too hot. Marriage to Merle didn't elevate Leona's career the way people assumed it would. Instead, it began to eclipse it. Before, she had been Leona Williams, rising songwriter, radio host, performer in her own right. After 1978, the industry quietly recast her as Mrs. Merle Haggard. The spotlight turned into a shadow. Her songs, sharp and unflinching, often ended up credited under Merle's name. Interviews that should have celebrated her craft reduced her to the harmony singer who happened to share his bed. When she corrected the record, the label executives rolled their eyes. Too sensitive, too difficult. Best to smile and let the myth carry on. Venues that once welcomed her as a solo act now required Merle's approval before booking. Journalists who once called her a rising star introduced her as an accessory. And when she pushed back, she was reminded that he was the legend, and she was lucky to share his stage. On tour, the image of perfection was rehearsed nightly. She dressed sharp, sang with fire, and held the crowd in her hands, even while her own identity was slipping through her fingers. Leona had built her own boots long before Merle, but now, step by step, the industry was untying the laces. For years, Leona held the line. She wrote songs that cut deep, stood steady when Merle's temper or silences threatened to swallow the room, and convinced herself the music would balance the scales. But love built on exhaustion eventually collapses. The breaking point wasn't a dramatic fight or headline scandal. It came quietly, in a dressing room outside Tulsa. Leona handed Merle a new song, raw, bleeding with the truth of their latest argument. He glanced at it, nodded once, and set it down like a receipt. No reaction, no acknowledgement, no recognition of the cost behind those words. Then he walked out. That stillness after years of storm told her everything. Merle wasn't going to change, and she wasn't willing to disappear, so she started packing. Not in anger, but in survival. In 1983, the divorce papers were signed without fanfare. No press releases, no public spectacle, just silence, the kind that hurts more than shouting. The industry barely blinked. Merle drifted on, already entangled in another chapter. Leona, meanwhile, was left to rebuild not just her career, but herself. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was realizing how much of herself she'd given away trying to stay. When the marriage ended, the silence that followed was almost worse than the heartbreak. The phone stopped ringing, record deals slowed, and more than one promoter acted like her talent had expired along with the relationship. For years, she'd been introduced as Merle Haggard's wife. Now she was Merle Haggard's ex. The industry couldn't see her beyond that frame. But Leona wasn't done. She poured her heart into new albums, some of her strongest work. But without a famous husband attached, they struggled to chart. Still, the songs resonated with the people who mattered. At small-town theaters and county fairs, fans brought worn vinyls for her to sign, asking about the songs that had carried them through their own heartbreaks. Those questions, those quiet moments after shows, reminded her that music wasn't about charts. It was about connection. The venues were smaller now, the spotlights dimmer, but for the first time in years, the music belonged entirely to her. No compromises, no shadows. She sold CDs out of the trunk of her car, set up her own merch tables, and kept writing truths the industry didn't want to hear. She had lost the machine, yes, but she had regained her voice, and that was worth more than applause. Leona never staged a comeback tour. She didn't chase headlines or beg the industry to remember her. Instead, she kept showing up. One fairground stage, one VFW hall, one independent record at a time. What she built wasn't flashy, but it was real. And in that persistence, her influence began to ripple. Younger artists started finding her records, sometimes in their parents' collections, sometimes in dusty bins at secondhand shops. They heard something raw and unapologetic in her songs, honesty that hadn't been softened to fit radio standards. For women especially, her story resonated. Here was someone who had written truth even when the cost was high, who had lived through erasure and kept singing anyway. Backstage at shows, new voices would approach her, wide-eyed, asking how to last in a business that still struggled with women who spoke plainly. Leona told them what no executive ever would: write anyway, sing anyway, endure anyway. She reminded them that silence never moves music forward. She wasn't bitter, she was steady. And slowly, her name began to surface in liner notes, in interviews, in tribute concerts. Not because she demanded it, but because the next generation recognized what the industry had tried to overlook, that Leona Williams had always been more than a harmony. By the time Leona Williams turned 81, she had outlasted the storm. The industry had moved on long ago, but she was still standing, still writing, still singing when she chose to. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to speak plainly about the years spent in silence. She didn't write a bitter tell-all. That was never her way. Instead, she told the truth. In interviews, on stage, and in conversations with younger artists who needed to hear it. She spoke about songs she wrote that others claimed, about credit lines that skipped her name, about the pressure to smile when her heart was breaking. And she spoke without apology. The response wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Letters arrived from women who found strength in her words. Young singers thanked her for surviving in an industry that often punishes honesty. Fans reminded her of the nights her music pulled them through grief or heartbreak. For Leona, that mattered more than any award. Now, when she steps on stage, she doesn't need introductions that link her to someone else's legend. She plays her own songs, tells her own story, and lets the silence afterward say the rest. Because at 81, Leona Williams isn't just remembered, she's finally heard. And if you want more stories about the artists who shaped country music in ways most people never knew, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot more truth still waiting to be told.